Imagine for a moment being alone in a foreign land, with nothing but the clothes on your back and an uncertain future ahead. Sounds frightening, doesn't it? For many, this is a daily reality, facing loss, change, and challenges with no guarantee of success. Now, consider the example of Ruth, a woman who, amidst the chaos of her life, found the courage to make choices that would shape not only her destiny, but also that of future generations. What is it about this story, written thousands of years ago, that still resonates so powerfully today? The truth is, in a world where faith is often tested and despair can seem like the only option, Ruth's journey teaches us something deeply counterintuitive. Redemption can come from the most unlikely places. In times when we seek quick answers and easy solutions, Ruth chose the path of faith, diligence, and loyalty, even when everything around her suggested otherwise. It's no wonder that this seemingly simple story continues to inspire millions worldwide. But here's the real question. Why does this story captivate us so much? What makes people return to it time and again for inspiration and comfort? What can we learn in our own journey by looking at Ruth's courage, Boaz's kindness, and the divine providence that weaves every detail together? Keep watching and discover how this story can transform not just your view of the past, but also the present and future. From the start, Ruth was not a woman who belonged to the people of Israel. She came from Moab, a foreign land, and to many, she might have been seen as an outsider. Her journey, however, was marked by challenges that many of us can recognize: deep losses, moments of uncertainty, and, most importantly, the search for something greater than herself. What is fascinating about her story is that despite all of this, she did not let despair defeat her. Just as the Bible stories often show us, Ruth clung to her faith, her determination, and found redemption. In her journey, we can see echoes of our own daily struggles, especially when we face what seems to be the end of something and find a new perspective. In Ruth's time, the setting was one of loss and pain. A famine had ravaged Israel, and it was this desperate need that led Elimelech's family to leave their homeland. They moved to Moab, a place that might offer temporary sustenance, but brought new challenges with it. Imagine yourself in such a situation, being forced to leave what you know, hoping to find something better in unfamiliar territory. The stories of the Old Testament teach us that these moments of uncertainty are, in fact, opportunities in disguise. And Ruth, even in her position as a foreigner, faced these challenges with a resilience that would inspire generations. When Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, loses both her husband and sons, what is left for them? Many people, faced with such a situation, would have thrown in the towel. But Ruth, instead of taking the easier path of returning to her people, makes a surprising choice. She decides to stay by Naomi's side, adopting her people and her faith. Here, there is a powerful lesson about loyalty and commitment, something often forgotten in our modern society. How many times in our own relationships and work do we choose the easy way out instead of embracing the challenge and striving for something greater? Ruth reminds us that the Bible stories, especially in the book of Revelation, are filled with moments where faithfulness is rewarded. Ruth's decision to remain with Naomi was what defined the course of her life. It wasn't just a demonstration of love, but also of courage. In times of crisis, it's easy to want to flee, and many of us have been through this. But true strength appears when we choose to stay and fight for something greater than ourselves. And this isn't something that only applies to Bible stories. In our daily lives, whether in work, relationships, or even our internal struggles, we are often called to make difficult choices. It is in those choices that we find the true meaning of loyalty and faith. If there's anything we can take from the introduction to Ruth's journey, it is the certainty that faith, even in the most difficult moments, can be an infallible guide. It wasn't easy for Ruth, a Moabite woman, to integrate into a foreign people. But she understood that, often, the greatest challenges are the ones that bring the greatest rewards. And this doesn't apply only to Ruth. How many times in the Bible stories, both in the Old and New Testaments, do we see ordinary people transforming their lives through faith? Ruth is just another example of how determination and trust in something greater can change the course of a life. By the way, this trust in something greater is a theme that repeats in so many Bible stories. From the prophets of the Old Testament to the followers of Jesus in the New Testament, the act of believing, even when everything seems lost, is what truly makes the difference. Ruth chose to move forward, and that choice not only transformed her, but also placed her on the path to redemption. And who among us doesn't need that redemption at some point in life? Often, it takes just one courageous decision to change everything. Speaking of change, Ruth's story makes us question, how often are we willing to sacrifice comfort in search of something greater? Ruth gave up the familiar to embrace the unknown, trusting that the future could bring something better. And what about you? How often, in your own daily battles, do you choose to follow a harder path, but one with the potential to bring significant change? Ruth's story is a constant reminder that sacrifice, when guided by faith, is always worth it. The story of Ruth begins during a time of great famine in Israel. Imagine the scene: dry lands, failed crops, and despair taking over countless families. At that time, famine wasn't just a matter of food scarcity, but also a test of faith. It was the kind of situation that tested people's courage, forcing them to make difficult decisions. Elimelech, along with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, was one of those people. For them, the only option seemed to be to leave the land of Israel and seek sustenance in Moab, a foreign place. This migration brings with it many questions that echo in our own lives. How many times, in the face of difficulties, are we forced to leave our comfort zone and seek solutions where we least expected? Moab was a strange territory for the Israelites. And at that moment, the Bible's stories show us how risky this decision was. They left the promised land, where they were supposed to trust in God's provision, and went to a place that, for a long time, had been an enemy of the people of Israel. This choice wasn't simple. Just as in the Old Testament stories, we see that challenges often push us in directions we didn't plan. But it's interesting to note that even when everything seems to be against us, there's still a chance for redemption. The story of Ruth reminds us of that, even when things seem unsolvable. Unfortunately, Moab brought more pain than relief for Naomi and her family. Shortly after the move, Elimelech passed away, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. There's no doubt that this loss was devastating. Many of us, at some point in life, have experienced the weight of grief, and we know how much it can shake our convictions. And what happened to Naomi is something we see repeatedly in the Bible stories, especially in the book of Revelation, where losses and tragedies often precede moments of deep transformation. Naomi, like so many biblical characters, was challenged to find meaning amidst her pain. If that wasn't enough, Naomi also lost her 2 sons. Now, she was alone in a foreign land, without the support of those she loved. This leads us to reflect on how, even in the darkest situations, the Bible's stories teach us that there's always a path forward. Naomi decided to return to her homeland, Israel, believing that perhaps there she would find some comfort. And here we see an interesting parallel. How many times, after a great loss, do we seek to return to our roots? Naomi's journey reminds us of the importance of returning to what is familiar, to what strengthens us when we face great adversities. At this point in the story, Naomi does something surprising. She advises her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, to return to their families in Moab. After all, as young widows, they could still rebuild their lives there. Naomi's advice is logical, but also painful. She was essentially saying goodbye to the last part of her family. However, this attitude reveals Naomi's deep sense of compassion, something seen in many Bible stories. Even in her pain, she wasn't just thinking about herself, but also about the future of the people she loved. How many times in our own lives are we called to make similar sacrifices for others? This is where the fates of Ruth and Naomi begin to intertwine even more strongly. Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, decides to follow Naomi's advice and return to her family. But Ruth does something completely unexpected. She chooses to stay. This moment is crucial. Ruth, a Moabite woman with no obligation to follow Naomi, decides to remain by her mother-in-law's side, even if it meant facing an uncertain future. This makes us think, how many times, in the face of difficult choices, do we opt for the safer path? Ruth teaches us that sometimes true strength lies in standing firm, even when the road seems barren. Naomi and Ruth, now alone, begin their journey back to Israel. And this journey wasn't just physical, but also emotional and spiritual. The Old Testament Bible stories often show us that returning to one's homeland, or roots, is a symbol of renewal and hope. Naomi was returning to a land she had left in times of famine, but now with the hope of a new beginning. What she didn't know was that this return would mark the start of one of the most beautiful stories of redemption and faithfulness found in the Bible. And so, their journey continued. At that decisive moment, Ruth faced a choice that would define her life forever. Naomi, her mother-in-law, had suggested that she return to her own people, to her gods, and rebuild her life. The logical path would be to follow this advice. After all, who would stay with someone with no future prospects? But Ruth made the decision to stay with Naomi, a choice marked by unshakable loyalty. Here, we see a practical example of the kind of commitment we rarely find nowadays. In a world where everything seems disposable, from objects to relationships, Ruth teaches us that true value lies in remaining faithful, even when the path is uncertain. Her famous declaration, "Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God," resonates through the generations as an example of love and loyalty. Ruth's decision also makes us reflect on the power of the choices we make daily. How often are we tempted to choose the easier path? In the Bible stories, especially in the Old Testament, we repeatedly see characters facing similar dilemmas. What makes Ruth so extraordinary is that she didn't choose for convenience, but out of love and commitment. And often in our own lives, loyalty is tested in the most difficult situations. If you've ever had to decide between standing by someone in times of difficulty or taking a simpler path, you know how challenging that choice can be. Ruth reminds us that loyalty, even when not immediately rewarded, is a virtue that brings lasting fruits. There is something deeply touching about the way Ruth committed herself not only to Naomi, but also to the God of Israel. She didn't just adopt a new land, but also a new faith. This is something we see repeatedly in the Bible stories of the New Testament as well, where faith in God often drives individuals to great acts of courage. Ruth teaches us that true loyalty is not just a matter of words, but of actions. She didn't just promise to stay with Naomi, but put that promise into practice, day after day, working hard to support herself and her mother-in-law. This kind of dedication isn't something easily found, but it's something we can all learn and apply in our daily lives. Imagine for a moment how challenging it must have been for Ruth to leave everything she knew behind. She left her people, her culture, and even her religion, all to follow an uncertain path with Naomi. Yet, this is the beauty of her loyalty. She went beyond social conventions and followed the call of her heart. In a world that often places self-preservation above all else, Ruth shows us that there is strength in letting go of our own securities to support those we love. The Bible stories, especially the book of Revelation, are filled with characters who make enormous sacrifices for greater causes. Ruth is a clear example of how love and loyalty can move mountains. When we look at Ruth's decision, it's impossible not to question our own loyalties. To whom or what are we truly loyal? In modern society, where everything seems in constant flux, it's easy to lose sight of what truly matters. But Ruth teaches us that true loyalty isn't just in the words we say, but in the actions we take, especially when those actions lead us down a path of sacrifice and dedication. If we stop to think, how many times have we been challenged to be loyal in our own lives? And how have we responded to those challenges? Ruth's unwavering loyalty didn't go unnoticed. Boaz, Ruth's future husband, recognized how much she had sacrificed and how faithful she had been to Naomi. And it's precisely this loyalty that ends up being rewarded. Many times, in the Bible stories, we see that God honors those who demonstrate true loyalty, even in times of adversity. What we can learn from Ruth is that while loyalty may seem like a lonely road at first, it inevitably leads us to places of blessing and fulfillment. The question is, are we willing to be faithful, even when the future seems uncertain? In the end, Ruth's choice to remain by Naomi's side wasn't just a personal decision, but a milestone in the story of redemption. Without that act of loyalty, the lineage of David, and eventually Jesus, wouldn't have been preserved. This is the power of the choices we make. Sometimes the hardest and most sacrificial decisions are the ones that have the greatest impact, not just in our lives, but in the lives of future generations. Ruth, a Moabite woman, a foreigner, and a widow, became a key piece in the story of salvation. And it all began with a simple, yet profound, act of loyalty. After arriving in Bethlehem, Ruth knew she had to act. There was no time for complaints or uncertainties. She decided to go to the fields to glean grain, a common practice among the poor and foreigners at the time. Her diligence in seeking sustenance for herself and Naomi is admirable, showing that faith alone is not enough. Action is required. In many Bible stories, especially in the Old Testament, we see examples of individuals who, driven by their faith, took practical steps to face life's challenges. Ruth didn't wait for things to happen. She rolled up her sleeves and went to work, something we can apply in our own lives. When we face tough times, What can we do to diligently seek what we need? It's in this context that Boaz enters the story. He was a wealthy and influential man, the owner of the fields where Ruth was gleaning grain. But more than that, Boaz was a man of character. Upon noticing Ruth, he immediately inquired about her. He discovered that she was Naomi's daughter-in-law, and what really caught his attention was Ruth's loyalty and hard work. Here, we once again see a recurring theme in the Bible stories. God honors diligent work. Boaz, impressed by Ruth's dedication, decided to show kindness to her. And this is something we can learn from as well. Boaz didn't have to be kind to Ruth, but he chose to be. In our own lives, how many times do we choose to lend a hand to those working hard, even when there's no obligation to do so? Boaz's kindness wasn't limited to mere words. He took practical steps to ensure that Ruth was well treated while she worked in the fields. Instructing his workers to leave additional stalks of grain for her to gather, Boaz showed that true kindness goes beyond the surface. This is a perfect example of how the Bible stories from both the Old and New Testaments are filled with tangible actions that make a difference in others' lives. For Boaz, ensuring Ruth's safety and sustenance wasn't just a matter of generosity, but of justice. And often in our own journeys, we can ask ourselves, what are we doing to ensure that our kindness is expressed in a tangible way? Ruth, on her part, didn't allow Boaz's kindness to make her relax. She continued to work hard, gleaning in the fields until late. Her determination was evident to all around her. And this is something that the Bible stories repeatedly teach us. God blesses those who are diligent in their tasks. Ruth knew that despite Boaz's help, she still had to do her part. Many times, we expect others' kindness to solve all our problems, but Ruth reminds us that we must keep working, even when life seems to be giving us a break. The relationship between Boaz and Ruth offers us a glimpse into the importance of the collaboration between kindness and diligence. Boaz provided the opportunities, but it was Ruth's continued effort that turned those opportunities into sustenance for her family. How many times in our own lives do we receive help, but fail to fully capitalize on it because we're not willing to continue working hard? Ruth and Boaz show us that true prosperity comes when these two elements, kindness and diligence, are in harmony. Another interesting point is how Boaz's kindness was deeply rooted in his faith. He saw in Ruth a woman worthy of respect, despite her status as a foreigner and widow. The Bible stories, especially the book of Revelation, show us that God does not make distinctions between those who seek Him with a sincere heart, regardless of their origin. Boaz understood this, and that's why he was able to recognize Ruth's value, something many others might have overlooked. And this makes us reflect. How many times do we judge people by their appearance or situation, without considering what really matters? Boaz teaches us to look beyond external circumstances and see a person's heart. By the end of the day, Ruth's diligence and Boaz's kindness began to create a special bond between them. This relationship, initially based on mutual respect and compassion, would soon blossom into something deeper. But what we can learn here is that even in the most casual relationships, there are opportunities to transform others' lives through small acts of kindness. Boaz changed Ruth's life trajectory with a simple act of generosity, and Ruth, in turn, transformed her own destiny with her hard work. The Bible stories are filled with moments like this, where collaboration between individuals creates unexpected and miraculous results. The introduction of the kinsman-redeemer concept in Ruth's story is one of the most fascinating moments of her journey. Boaz, being a close relative of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, had the responsibility to redeem the family's land and, by extension, protect Ruth and Naomi. This role of the kinsman-redeemer was a common practice in the Bible stories, especially in the Old Testament, where the closest relative had the obligation to care for the deceased's property and family. But Boaz didn't act out of mere obligation. His kindness and integrity were evident from the moment he met Ruth, and this only intensified when he took on this responsibility. Boaz knew that taking on the role of kinsman-redeemer wouldn't be a simple task. There was another man closer in the lineage, with the first right to the land and to Ruth. However, Boaz, with his wisdom and character, handled the situation carefully. He knew this matter needed to be resolved honorably, following the traditions and customs of his people. And once again, in the Bible stories, we see how Boaz's wisdom guided him to make the right decisions. Life, like Ruth's story, often presents us with complex situations where patience and wisdom are essential to reaching a just and positive outcome. Boaz then goes to the other relative, who had the right to redeem the land. He proposed the situation transparently, explaining that along with the land would come the responsibility of marrying Ruth, ensuring Elimelech's lineage would continue. The relative, upon realizing the implications of this responsibility, declined the offer, allowing Boaz to take on the role of kinsman redeemer. This moment is crucial in the narrative because it shows how God, through the Bible stories, often places the right people in the right places at the right time. Boaz not only took on the land, but also the commitment to care for Ruth and Naomi, sealing his destiny with Ruth's. Here we see the importance of the concept of redemption, which is central not only in Ruth's story, but in many other Bible stories, including the book of Revelation. By redeeming Elimelech's land and family, Boaz not only restored what had been lost, but also paved the way for a new life for Ruth and Naomi. And this makes us reflect on our own lives.
How?
Many times do we feel that something has been lost forever, only to discover that with the help of others and God, we can find a way to redeem what seemed irretrievable. Boaz's action also teaches us something about responsibility. He could have walked away from the situation, like the other relative did, but he chose to take on the commitment, not out of obligation, but out of love and honor. The Bible stories are full of examples of people who, even when faced with great responsibilities, decided to do what was right. Boaz is an example of this. He understood that being a redeemer meant more than just reclaiming land. It meant reclaiming lives, offering a future to those who would otherwise be at the mercy of fate. And in our own lives, how often are we called to be redeemers for others? Maybe not in the literal sense, but through our acts of kindness and responsibility, we can help transform someone's life. Boaz's role as kinsman redeemer also carries deep symbolism. He didn't just redeem Elimelech's family, but also ensured that Ruth, a foreigner, was fully integrated into the people of Israel. This act of inclusion reminds us of the many Bible stories that speak of how God welcomes those who, in the world's eyes, may seem like outsiders. Boaz looked beyond Ruth's origins and recognized her value as a person, as someone deserving of a second chance. This attitude of inclusion and redemption is something we should reflect on in our own lives, especially in a world that is often quick to judge and exclude. Ultimately, Boaz's role as kinsman redeemer paved the way for something much greater than he could have imagined. His act of kindness and responsibility allowed Ruth to become King David's great-grandmother, linking her lineage directly to Jesus. The Bible stories often show us that acts of kindness, no matter how small they seem, can have eternal repercussions. By redeeming Ruth, Boaz wasn't just preserving a family lineage, but contributing to God's greater plan. And this makes us think, how many of our own daily acts have the potential to impact future generations? With the kinsman redeemer situation resolved, Boaz made the decision to marry Ruth. This marriage wasn't just a family agreement, but a true symbol of redemption and restoration. Ruth, who had once been a Moabite widow with no clear prospects for the future, now found herself married to a righteous and kind man. The Bible stories, both in the Old and New Testaments, are filled with moments when divine providence intervenes to turn situations of despair into moments of great joy and hope. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz reminds us that even when the future seems uncertain, faith and diligence can lead us to a destiny of unexpected blessings. Ruth's marriage to Boaz also represents the union of two cultures. Ruth was a Moabite, a foreigner in Israel, and this marriage was a clear example of how inclusion and respect for differences can generate something beautiful. Boaz not only accepted Ruth as his wife, but also recognized her dignity and value. This is a recurring theme in the Bible stories, welcoming those who are marginalized or foreign. In our own lives, how many times do we have the opportunity to welcome those who are different from us? The marriage of Boaz and Ruth shows us that when we overcome cultural and social barriers, we create bonds that can change the future of all involved. Another fascinating aspect of this marriage is how it was directly linked to the lineage of David and, eventually, Jesus. When Boaz married Ruth, he was unknowingly becoming part of God's divine plan of redemption, which would culminate in the coming of Christ. The Bible stories, especially the book of Revelation, often reference how earthly events have eternal repercussions. Boaz and Ruth didn't know that their marriage would impact future generations so significantly. This makes us reflect on the choices we make today. Who knows how many of our decisions, no matter how simple they seem, may have lasting effects and influence lives far beyond our own. Ruth and Boaz's marriage also teaches us about the importance of selfless love. Boaz, from the beginning, demonstrated a love that wasn't based on self-interest, but on a genuine desire to care and protect. Ruth, in turn, showed unwavering devotion not only to Boaz but also to her new faith and the people of Israel. This kind of sacrificial love is a lesson that the Bible stories teach us repeatedly. In a world where love is often seen as conditional, Ruth and Boaz show us that true love is one that is willing to make sacrifices for the good of others. Furthermore, Ruth and Boaz's marriage brought stability and security to Naomi. Naomi, who had once lost everything, now found comfort in seeing her daughter-in-law married and protected. The Old Testament Bible stories often speak of the cycle of losses and restorations that many people face. For Naomi, Ruth's marriage was a true restoration of her hope and faith. It's interesting to note how, even in moments when everything seems lost, God is working behind the scenes to bring healing and renewal. How many times in our own lives do we go through periods of despair only to discover that something greater is being prepared for us? And so, through a seemingly simple marriage, we see how God orchestrated a series of events that culminated in the redemption not just of Ruth and Naomi, but of an entire lineage. The Bible stories show us that God is a master at turning the ordinary into something extraordinary. The marriage of Boaz and Ruth, although it seemed like a common event, had a massive impact on the course of Israel's history and the story of salvation. And this leads us to an important question. Are we paying attention to the small blessings and everyday events that may have a bigger meaning than we imagine? Finally, Ruth and Boaz's marriage offers us a vision of hope. Although Ruth began her journey in Moab as a widow with nothing, she ended it as the wife of a righteous man, fully integrated into the people of Israel, and part of a lineage that would bring the Savior into the world. The Bible stories are full of examples like this, where God takes what seems like a hopeless situation and turns it into something beautiful and redemptive. And so, Ruth and Boaz's marriage is not just the closing of a cycle, but the beginning of something much greater. Ruth's story is a powerful demonstration of how faith and divine providence work in harmony. From the beginning, Ruth made decisions based on faith, even when the path ahead seemed dark. She didn't know what awaited her alongside Naomi, but she chose to trust in the God of Israel. And that trust was rewarded in ways she could never have imagined. The Bible stories, both from the Old and New Testaments, often show us that faith isn't just a passive belief, but an active force that drives us to make courageous decisions. Ruth, through her faith, teaches us that when we trust in something greater than ourselves, we are opening the doors for divine providence to enter our lives. The concept of providence is something that permeates Ruth's entire narrative. From the moment she began gleaning in Boaz's fields to the day of her marriage, God's hand was guiding every step of her journey. Providence, as we see in the Bible stories, doesn't mean that everything will be easy or without challenges, but that there is a greater purpose in every detail. Ruth could never have imagined that her decision to follow Naomi would lead her to marry Boaz and eventually become David's great-grandmother. That's how providence works. It uses even the most difficult situations to lead us to our destiny. And this makes us think about our own lives. How many times, without realizing it, is divine providence working in our favor? Ruth's faith is a clear example of how trusting in God can transform a life. She had no guarantees, but she moved forward with determination. And often, in the Bible stories, especially in the book of Revelation, we see how the faith of those who trust in God leads them to unexpected victories. Ruth wasn't intimidated by the adversities, and her unwavering faith was a catalyst for the blessings that would come in her life. This leads us to question, how are we nurturing our own faith? Are we willing to move forward, even when we don't have all the answers? Ruth teaches us that true faith is the one that remains firm, even in the moments of greatest uncertainty. Divine providence, however, doesn't act in isolation. Ruth also needed to act. Her faith wasn't passive but active, and she dedicated herself to hard work to ensure her sustenance and Naomi's. Many times, in the Bible stories, we see that faith must be accompanied by action. It is the combination of these two forces, faith and diligence, that creates the perfect setting for God's providence to manifest. Ruth didn't wait for something to fall from the sky, but worked hard, and it was this effort that put her on the path to Boaz. In our own lives, we are called to do the same. Faith without action is barren, but when we combine the two, we make room for God to work. What also becomes clear in Ruth's story is that God's providence isn't restricted to grand events, but also to the smallest details. From the field where Ruth went to glean to Boaz's decision to redeem her, every small event was orchestrated for God's greater plan to be fulfilled. The Bible stories are filled with examples of how God uses the simplest details to accomplish his purposes. Ruth could have gone to any other field, but it was the one where Boaz was. This makes us reflect. Are we paying attention to the small signs of providence in our lives? How many times is something seemingly insignificant actually part of a much bigger plan? Faith and providence didn't just transform Ruth's life, but also Naomi's. At the beginning of the story, Naomi was desolate, bitter from losing her husband and sons. But through Ruth's faith and decisions, Naomi found redemption and renewal. The Bible stories often speak of how one person's faith can impact another's life. Ruth, by trusting in God, brought hope to Naomi, showing that divine providence isn't limited to one life, but extends to touch everyone around us. This reminds us that our actions, guided by faith, can have a much greater impact than we imagine. Finally, Ruth's story teaches us that faith and providence are not just distant theological concepts, but practical realities that can deeply shape our lives. When we put our faith into action and trust that God is in control, we can be assured that no matter the challenges we face, divine providence is working in our favor. And like Ruth, we can discover that what seemed like a simple decision of faith was, in fact, the beginning of a story of redemption and transformation. Now that you've followed Ruth's inspiring story, the question that remains is, how can this impact your life? Think for a moment about the difficulties you face. How many times have you thought about giving up? Ruth teaches us that even when everything seems lost, there is always a path of redemption ahead. All it takes is believing, acting in faith, and trusting in divine providence. So, why not apply this example in your own journey? What are you willing to sacrifice to live a life of purpose, loyalty, and faith? Reflect. In which areas of your life could you be more diligent, more faithful, or more open to divine providence? It could be in your work, your relationships, or even your own spiritual walk. Ask yourself, am I doing enough to honor my commitments and my beliefs? Or am I letting discouragement pull me away from my true destiny? Ruth's story is a powerful reminder that, with courage and determination, we can all find redemption. If you want to continue learning and being inspired by stories of faith and transformation, subscribe to the channel now and activate notifications. This will ensure you don't miss any content that can help transform your life, just as Ruth's life was transformed. Let's go on this journey together.